Okay, so I think we can start. It's my pleasure to introduce Alexandra Trachsel from King's College London and the University of Hamburg. Alexandra has a Marie Curie intra-European fellowship to spend this year at King's College in London. But apart from this, she has a PhD in ancient Greek philology. She's presenting today about presenting fragments as quotations or quotations as fragments. And she's lecturer at the Institut für Griechische und Lateinische Philologie at the University of Hamburg. Yeah, and I hand it to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction and for having allowed me to come here and to present my project. I start by saying that it is based in classics. I am working on, as the title says it, Demetrios of Skepsis, who is a scholar from the 2nd century BCE, working probably in one of the Greek centers of researches, such as the Library of Alexandria, or more relevant for Demetrios, the Library of Pergamon in Asia Minor. To set first the broader context, I need the second slide, yes. I may start by saying that his major field of research was Homeric scholarship. He was writing a huge commentary on a special part of the Trojan text, the so-called Trojan Catalogue. The enumeration given in Book 2 of the Iliad of the warriors fighting on the Trojan side in the famous Trojan War. It is therefore the counterpart of the Catalogue of the Ships, which was the subject of one of the seminars in December. Further, to understand the scope of Demetrios' work, it is important to know that he is working at the same time as Aristarchus and Crates of Malos, the two most influential ancient scholars with regard to Homeric scholarship. This is important to know because even if Demetrios is rather unknown today, it was not so in antiquity. There was, as far as we still know, a huge debate going on among the scholars of those days about the Homeric text and its content. Demetrios took part in this discussion and must have had a rather large impact, as almost immediately there was a response to his work, written by another Homeric scholar, Apollodorus of Athens, who attacked, criticized, and expanded the work of Demetrios. Demetrios was therefore not an unknown would-be scholar, but one of the major players shaping the way scholarship took in the Hellenistic period. However, and this may be the difference to his fellow researchers, Demetrios was a local scholar, working to a large extent for the interest of his hometown. This is relevant because the topic Demetrios was dealing with concerned mainly the setting where the story told in the Iliad took place. And even if today this may not be perceived as such anymore, in those days, focusing on the setting of a story and trying to locate it in a real landscape was something rather revolutionary. Previously, scholarship, which was at its beginning, or let's say a little bit more than 100 years old, focused mainly on the text and the best or most accurate reading of a given passage. Ancient scholarship started therefore with textual criticism and moved then to other topics, one among them being precisely the issues about the setting of the story. This particular phase in the development of ancient scholarship explains, to some extent, why Demetrios chose to comment on the Trojan Catalogue. This part of the Homeric text, together with its better-known counterpart of the Catalogue of the Ships, was one of the parts which contained the largest amount of geographical information, as there are mainly enumeration of the heroes taking part in the Trojan War, giving most of the time their place of origin. This part of the Homeric text provided, therefore, one of the best starting points for Demetrios to build his research on. Further, by the time of Demetrios, the scholarly debate about the landscape got a more political or social dimension. It was very prestigious for a local community or a town if it could claim to have been mentioned in the Trojan Catalogue, or more generally speaking, in the Homeric text. Or, on the contrary, as it was the case with Skepsis, Demetrios' hometown, if the place was not mentioned in the Homeric text, its inhabitant had to find a way to construct for their hometown a past at least as prestigious as the one described in the Homeric poems. And this is basically what Demetrios did. He, for instance, claimed that his hometown has been founded by the sons of Hector and Aeneas just after the fall of Troy, when they had to find a new place to settle. And everybody who is somehow familiar with the story of the Trojan War knows that the claim is in sharp contradiction with the mainstream story where the son of Hector is killed by the Achaeans during the siege of Troy. Aeneas, on the contrary, was, according to the mainstream version, able to flee with his father and his son, and went to Italy, where later Rome was founded. Also, in other places we see how Demetrios is working for his hometown, trying to make it as famous as possible. Often he can rely for such statements on an extremely good knowledge of the history and the surroundings of his hometown. But still, in other fragments, we have also kept considerations about textual variants he's discussing and evidence for his awareness of the history of the Homeric text. This in turn suggests that he may have been more focused on the text and may have entered into competition with the big names in the field, such as Aristarchus and Crates. So to sum up, we may think of Demetrios as being someone who was on the one hand engaged in hardcore scholarship, but who on the other acted as a local man profoundly linked to the place where he was living. Sorry. And now going to the work itself. We have first to acknowledge that we know very little about it. We have kept only 75, sometimes rather short fragments, all of them preserved through indirect transmission, which mean basically through quotation and allusion made by later scholars who used his work for their own purposes. Actually, to be more precise, there is currently a discussion about the number of fragments, as it seems possible now to increase it with some papyrological findings, which were relevant for Demetrios. But unfortunately, these pieces are either not long enough to bring substantial new insight or contain parts of already known fragments, and therefore the amount of information about Demetrios' work has not yet increased substantially. The title, however, is fairly well attested as Hotroikos Diakosmos, which refers back to the part of the Homeric text Demetrios is commenting on. Indeed, the two Homeric catalogues are either referred to by Ho Katalogos or by Ho Diakosmos. This is all we know about the work. And this particular state of preservation, which means very few elements, moreover transmitted as quotation, orientates the editorial work in a special direction. As we have kept, so to speak, only the responses of these ancient authors to Demetrios' work, not the work itself. It will become indeed very important to give to this intermediate state, where people were using Demetrios' work, much more attention than it has been done so far. Further, the history of transmission of this source text also influenced the way the fragments of Demetrios come down to us. As they were embedded in this work, they suffered from the same changes as the work containing them. From this, it ensues that the two works are closely linked, and sure should be the handling with them when aiming at establishing an edition of the lost work. However, as in the case of Demetrios, there are often many different source texts for a given author's fragment, and it would not be possible to study the history of transmission of all of them before focusing on the fragments of Demetrios. Unless you are doing something completely different, which is the edition of the source text themselves. For Demetrios, this means that one should edit first work with extremely different history of transmission, such as Strabo, Athenaeus, or the Scholia to the Iliad, before focusing on Demetrios. Therefore, when starting to think about establishing a new edition of the fragments of Demetrios, especially when one plans to do it in a digital environment, two questions should be addressed with regard to the special state of preservation. These are the two questions. The first one, how to represent the text which are not based on the transcription of a set of manuscripts, or let's say of any ancient documents, but on previous edition themselves based on critical edition of ancient texts. A gap between the manuscript and the edition of the fragments is necessary, or at least it is a step which cannot be missed out, because, as just mentioned, we cannot make new edition of all of the text where Demetrios is quoted and focus on the fragments of Demetrios. It would indeed be another task to start from the text preserved in their entirety, make edition, or better, make digital edition of them, and find then the quotation of more or less lost author within these new editions. This is the approach other digital projects are taking, especially those working on the Anteneus. His Deipnosiphistai is indeed a very good example of an ancient work with many quotations. It should, however, still be possible to start from the other end and focus on the quoted author rather than on the quoting one. The second question, how to present as accurately as possible the links between the preserved quotation in a given source text and Demetrios' work, as there are more or less close renderings of an initial lost piece. This is something very important we have to bear in mind when dealing with fragments of a work being mainly transmitted through quotations. Most of the time, edition of such kind of works create the illusion that there are reconstruction of the lost work. But we have to stay aware of the fact that, however complete this edition may be, there are only collection of either statements about the work, which are grouped under the heading of testimonia, or precisely more or less close rendering of passages from the original work, which passeth through the mind and or writing process of the second author. Here again, there are a couple of new digital projects dealing with this aspect, and you may certainly get some solution from them for the issues I am raising here, but I will come back to this later. The indirect access to the ancient work is also seen when starting from another point of view. Indeed, most of the time, when handling with an author whose work is lost, we start by studying the previous modern edition of this author. When doing so, we see that the modern editors do not agree about the fragments, their appearance or not appearance in a collection, the way they should be edited and presented, or about the length the piece considered as fragments should have. Therefore, there is a further question which should be addressed. How to keep the choice modern scholars or editors made in this process visible for the reader? The third question should also remain us of another characteristic of fragments preserved in form of quotations. Their existence depends most of the time not only on one choice made in antiquity, but also on a modern choice. The modern editors read the work where the quotation have been transmitted and decide which part of the initial text would be a fragment from a given author. Therefore, we have actually two selection processes to deal with when trying to edit fragmentary preserved authors. First, the author, the ancient author who had Demetrios' work at their disposal, chose some of the passages which seem relevant for them. And in a second step, the modern editors try to extract these pieces again out of their context. Therefore, we should stay aware of the fact that the fragments have no independent existence and should be represented within their context. So, from this point of view too, the link to the work where the fragments has been preserved should be highlighted, enabling us in doing so to express not only the ancient author choice, but also the one made by the modern editors. Let me now go further into detail for each of the questions I am just mentioning, before dealing in the second part of my presentation with the content of the fragments and the way of presenting them. First, I would like to come back to the idea that when with editions of fragments, the editorial work will not start from the manuscript themselves, but with the previous edition of those works where the fragments have been preserved. This is necessary as often, or rather almost always, the fragments have been transmitted in several different source texts, and it would not be possible, as I just said, for one scholar to do first the edition of all of the source text before looking at the part within this text which could be considered as belonging to the author one is interested in. Therefore, there are necessary two steps when dealing with fragments. You have two groups of scholars. Those dealing with the fragments will build on the work those who were interested in the source text have done. But in this situation, there are some difficulties, as an edition of a fragmentary preserved author does not mean the same thing as doing an edition of an entire text. There is no need for deciphering of the original document or for a diplomatic transcription of it. The work starts directly with the critical text as it has been established by previous scholars. But as a matter of fact, there is often more than one edition of a work from antiquity. So we have the following situation. A set of manuscript on this side leads to a set of edition of the source text. And you have edition A, B, C, and D. Up to now, there is nothing really surprising for someone working with ancient text. Any quotation from or allusion to an ancient text presupposes that one chooses one of the many editions and explains and specifies that one is using one particular one. When now dealing with fragments within the source text, there is a second choice which should be taken into consideration. It is basically the choice of the previous scholar who were dealing with the fragmentary preserved author and made their own collection of pieces which they thought to belong to the work of the ancient scholar. So we have a further layer. Editor 2 in this case, which is not the editor of the source text but the editor of the fragments, may have used the same edition of the source text as editor 1, but he may not agree with him about his choice when it comes to decide about which part from the source text belong to the quoted author. Editor 3 may agree with editor 1 or 2. In this example, he agrees with editor 1 about the choice he made in the text about the part which belongs to Demetrios, but he may have chosen a different version, additional edition. Here in this case is edition 3, and then still have a completely different text of the fragment. So the question is, which text is fragment 1? The most interesting answer would certainly be all of them together. And then we should represent fragment 1 as the sum of all of these editorial choices, making clear in the presentation of the text where the previous editor did not agree. And I presented this like that. Ideally, not only the text of the source text should be presented, but also the apparatus criticus going along with each of the edition of the source text, as the apparatus shows or explains the choices the modern editor made when establishing the text. This is the first case, where the editor agrees at least about the fact that the fragment is coming from one unique source text, let's say Strabo in our example. In some cases, however, there are more than one source text from which a fragment of Demetrios is taken. In this case, because the passage from the two different source texts are almost similar in their context or wording, editors believe that it is the same passage from the original work which has been used in two different ways in antiquity, most of the time by two different scholars, which are represented by Ancient Work 1 and Ancient Work 2. And therefore got from the beginning two different renderings. This situation is, however, not the same as saying fragment 1 is from source text A, whereas fragment 2 is from source text B. This would mean that even if the two fragments are from the same work, they come from different places within this book. For instance, one comes from the beginning, whereas the other comes from the end. They can be quite different in their content and not be linked to each other. In the case I am presenting, the two pieces are believed to illustrate exactly the same part or passage of the work. In some cases, the link between the wording of fragment 2a and fragment 2b is obvious, and there is no difficulty to believe that they come from the same passage. In some cases, however, the link one editor sees between two texts is more controversial, especially when there is, for instance, no name appearing in one of the fragments, or if fragment 2b is further short or coming from a work where the history of transmission is itself complex. It should therefore be possible to express this in a digital edition, especially as sometimes a later editor decided not to include a passage in his collection because of a number of difficulties linked to work 2, let's say. If you would then have something like this, if we want to present it in a digital edition, it becomes quite obvious that the fragments start to become, in such a way of presenting them, rather a cluster of different renderings than an isolated text which is supposed to reflect the original state. Further, in each case, as mentioned above, it would be needed to show the context, which means to give a longer passage of the relevant source text in order to understand how the ancient author used his sources. The disagreement among modern scholars is partly explained because the quoting method in antiquity were not very precise, or at least were different from our modern standards. It is therefore extremely difficult to decide which part of a text may belong to a quotation and which part may not. Likewise, it is also often very difficult to decide if a passage is a verbatim quotation, a paraphrase, or another more or less close rendering of the original text. In order to show this hesitation, it would then be necessary to give the line of argument or the context of the source text, which actually are the dotted lines in my slide, so that the modern reader might decide for himself if he follows one or the other editor or if he forms his own opinion. Therefore, to sum up the editorial situation with all these issues and difficulty, I may just present a last slide. We have first, on the one side, the work of Demetrios, which is lost and for which we do not know how many examples existed and how different they were when they were used by further later authors like Strabo or Athenaeus. Then we have the step of the ancient source text quoting Demetrios. Here too we do no longer have the original work or the examples circulating in antiquity. All we have kept here are the medieval copies of them, which are represented in my second step by Ancient Work 1, Ancient Work 2. These medieval manuscripts have been edited by modern scholars to make modern edition of them. You find again the colored line. I presented edition 1, edition B, edition C, and so on. A further group of scholars looked into this text and focused on the quotation preserved in them. They extracted them and recomposed the work of the lost author. And for them, or at least for the scholars of the 19th century, this activity meant reconstructing or rediscovering the ancient lost work. Fragment 2 in a modern edition is believed to illustrate a piece of the lost work, as it stands at the beginning of my presentation. However, today, and precisely because of this complexity of the state of transmission, this illusion cannot be believed anymore. Indeed, as the picture may have shown, the situation of transmission is far too complex to hope for such a discovery. We should therefore rather focus on representing the history of transmission as accurately as possible and make it visible for further readers. Before passing to the second part of my presentation, I might just mention, after having mainly presented the difficulties one faces with this approach, a few attempts of solutions. First of all, the rendering of the relationship between two texts, which are supposed to be two different renderings of a same original but lost passage. The researches going on in the Sharing Ancient Wisdom project are very helpful. The aim of this project is to describe the state of transmission of sayings attributed to wise men and philosophers. These sayings were reused and adapted to different contexts and in different languages, and the Sharing Ancient Wisdom project is precisely trying to make a digital tool enabling scholars to represent this different state of reuse. This approach is therefore extremely interesting and may precisely help us to represent the way the fragments of Demetrios were preserved. As I mentioned above, the existence of the fragments depend on two choices, one made in antiquity and one coming from modern times. It is especially the choice from the ancient time which could be expressed by the tools of the project from King's College London. As far as the modern choices are concerned, another ongoing project involving several institutions could bring some solutions. These are the efforts aiming at finding canonical citation schemata for quoting passages from ancient work in a digital environment. The way this canonical citation work allows us to express the variation in length of the fragments as they appear in modern edition according to the editorial choices of modern editors. There remains, however, the last difficulty I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that an editor of fragments starts from previous editions and not from the manuscript or the ancient document themselves. It is certainly to some extent a temporary difficulty because not all of the ancient texts are available in a digital form. Indeed, if more digital editions of entirely preserved text were available, the fragments preserved in form of quotation within this text could be treated in another way, and for instance the link between the source text and the quotation could become something obvious. However, the fact that fragments come always in a second step after the work with entirely preserved text is something characteristic of fragments. As I told you, they have no independent existence, but were rediscovered by scholars who looked into the preserved source text to find them. And actually, the interest in fragments started in a moment of time when Renaissance scholars started to feel that they had found in the remaining medieval manuscripts all what was left from antiquity. They became aware of the fact that the remains were limited and represented only a tiny little bit of the ancient literature. In order to find new works which may increase the amount of preserved items from antiquity, the scholars started to look for lost pieces within the surviving material. So the handling with fragments and the making of edition of entirely preserved text is always something linked and goes in one direction, namely from the entirely preserved text to the fragments. Now, having said this and left a number of questions open, I would like to turn to the second part of my presentation and focus more on the content of the fragments. Indeed, as I mentioned before, the content of the fragments of Demetrios of Skepsis deal most of the time with topographical issues and more precisely with place name occurring in the Iliad, a literary text, and the way they could be located or identified in a real landscape. For most of them, this means the historical Troad in Asia Minor. This special topic influences, for instance, the way the fragments have been arranged in the previous editions. In the case of Demetrios of Skepsis, this question of arrangement or ordering of the fragments is particularly important for two reasons. First, we have kept very few fragments, and they do not allow us to reconstruct the original structure of the work, and we have therefore again to rely on modern opinions about this. Secondly, the way modern editors arrange the fragments differ widely from one edition to the other, and might provide completely different perception of the work. Therefore, we should give more attention to this part too, and maybe also use the new possibilities provided by digital tools to find solutions for this aspect. In the first part of my presentation, I just started to speak about fragment 1 and fragment 2. But in order to be able to consider one part of a given source text as fragment 1 and not as fragment 2, there should be a principle according to which it can be decided if one quotation precedes the other or not. In some fragments, there are some indication allowing modern readers to find out where in the original work the passage were written. Most of the time, this means that the ancient author quoting Demetrios specifies from which book of Demetrios' work the passage comes. For instance, Athenaeus may say that he found a statement from Demetrios in book 1 of his work. In such a case, we preserve the indication that Demetrios dealt with a given issue at the beginning of his work. But such kind of fragments are rather seldom. Most of the time, the kind of information is absent, and we have again to rely on the choices made by modern scholars. If, for instance, an editor believes that a given quotation was rather belonging to the beginning of the work, he will count it among the first fragments in his collection. But often the modern editors do not agree and understand the content of the fragment in different ways. In our case of the fragment of Demetrios, the first editor, Richard Gede, arranged the fragment according to a geographical principle. He was mainly focusing on Strabo's text, who was a geographer and described, among other places, also the Troad. The plan of of Strabo's description of the Troad is in short from north to south and from east to west. The white arrows representing the narration of Strabo. In his description, Strabo quotes Demetrios as a valuable source. Let's say at some point in his narration he mentions Demetrios. And the first editor marked these passages as quotation of Demetrios and counted them according to the occurrence in the narration of Strabo. Just simply counted them. The first occurrence of the name of Demetrios in Strabo's description becomes then fragment 1, the second occurrence fragment 2, and so forth. The other fragments coming from other source texts in Strabo are added then later, independently, before or after the core elements. So I just presented this, all the rest, either before or after. This is, however, only one way of arranging the fragments. With this arrangement, the point of view of the author who are quoting Demetrios is emphasized. It may be a very valuable presentation as it allows us to focus on one of the interesting aspects of Demetrios' work, the geographical content. When starting, for instance, from a map of the Troad, while dealing with the fragments of Demetrios, we may ask questions such as, what places did Demetrios mention in his work? Were the place name, if they can be found, located at the same place as they are nowadays? Were the several places with the same name, and if so, what evidence did Demetrios use to differentiate them? And finally, for what kind of places did Strabo use Demetrios as authority? But in order to be able to answer such question, or let's say in order to allow such question to be asked by reader of the new edition, there is another difficulty which should be resolved. This difficulty arises because some of the fragments of Demetrios speak about controversial places, which sometimes have not yet been found and cannot be located on a map. And often already the ancient commentators come to the conclusion that a given place name cannot be found and located. In other cases, there are more than one place with the same, which can be identified with the one mentioned by Demetrios, and therefore a location on a map is also problematic. Especially as here too the controversies may sometimes go back to antiquity and may have been the reason for Demetrios' comment. Further, as Demetrios aimed at commenting part of the Homeric text, some of the fragments may mention place names which do not belong to any real topography. And finally, there is also the case where the discussion is about a variant of a place name occurring in the Homeric text, and it is extremely difficult to decide how to take account of such an hesitation when trying to locate the place names on a map. Moreover, the geographical approach may not be the only one, especially if we take account for the more problematic fragments I just mentioned. If Demetrios was interested in explaining the place name, or more generally speaking, the words appearing in the Homeric text, one should maybe start from this point and try to link the remaining fragments to the Homeric text, more precisely to the line corresponding to the catalogue of the Trojan. Such an approach would allow us to take account of the fact that Demetrios' work was mainly a commentary-like exposition of Demetrios' statements, which followed in its structure the outline of the Trojan catalogue. To some extent, this is also a geographical arrangement, as the composition of the catalogue follows also some topographical principle. But it would be a richer way of accessing the fragments of Demetrios than a map of the Troad, and would offer much more opportunities with regard to our understanding of Demetrios' work. However, with such an approach, there are again several difficulties which should first be resolved. For instance, we would need to decide which fragment could be linked to which word of the Homeric text. For some of the fragments, such a link is quite obvious, especially those mentioning directly toponyms occurring in the Trojan catalogue, or those about textual criticism of a given line. But already here we have the difficulty that sometimes the lines Demetrios is commenting on do not come from the Trojan catalogue. So we have to assume that in some of his comments, Demetrios must have quoted other passages from the Homeric text, which could be either from the Iliad or from the Odyssey. This is certainly in accordance with the well-known scholarly principle of explaining Homer through Homer himself. But since we have lost, in the case of Demetrios, a large part of his text, we have not kept the path which led Demetrios from the Trojan catalogue to the preserved piece, and we have to guess how the bit we have preserved may have been linked to the Trojan catalogue. This is of course again due to the fact that we have only quotations. A later author may have taken out of Demetrios' long comment on a given line of the Trojan catalogue a piece which deals with the parallel passage Demetrios was only alluding to in order to make his point. We have kept the issues about this other passage, but do no longer know how this was used in the original comment. Another case is the fact that there could be more than one word in the Homeric text, which would be linked to one fragment. Or, as in the example I am giving here, the blue lines, a word may be mentioned more than once in the Homeric text, and even if the link between the word or the place name and the content of the fragment is quite firmly established, there still remains some ambiguity about which of the occurrences should be taken as entry for the link or the comment. Further, as shown in my example, in some cases it is also important to take into consideration the personal names and not only the place names. Indeed, often the heroes are mentioned by the word referring back to the place where they are living, especially in the Trojan catalogue, as I said before. Here, for instance, the Trojan and the Dardanians are actually named by the place where they are living. Further, it is often only possible to link a fragment to a given line through an action a hero performed in a given place, which is not mentioned in the Homeric catalogue. Let's say Pandarus, mentioned at the end of my example, goes to the river Skamandros, where he meets another hero. Demetrios is interested in explaining the setting of the river Skamandros, but does it when the name of Pandarus occurs in the Homeric text. So in order to find a link, we would not only look for the name of the Skamandros, but also for the one of Pandarus. And finally, there will be certainly the case where it is simply not possible to decide. Especially in the fragments which come from other sources than Strabo, the topic is often completely unrelated to the Homeric text. Therefore, for a large majority of the fragments, it will be problematic to establish such a link to the Homeric text, and the degree of certainty about such attribution should be expressed and made visible for the reader, who may decide for himself if he wants to accept the choice or not. But such an arrangement of the fragments, however complex its establishing may be, has also some advantages, as a whole range of new questions could be asked about both the Homeric text and Demetrios' work. For instance, we would be able to find out if Demetrios was the only scholar commenting about a given line of the Homeric text, or compare his explanation with the one from another scholar or with the one transmitted in the Scholia. Indeed, there are a lot of comments transmitted as Scholia in the margin of the medieval manuscripts, and most of the time they are anonymous, or at least they have been shortened or transformed, so that it is very difficult to attribute them to an ancient scholar, even if the name still occurs in the text. With such a presentation of the fragments of Demetrios as I just presented, we would have access to the scholarly debate about the Homeric text from a different point of view. We could then, for instance, compare the elements from debate which have been transmitted indirectly as quotation with those transmitted in the margin of the medieval manuscripts. However, before getting there and finding answer to all these new questions, the edition should first be made. However, as my project is still work in progress, I have mainly highlighted in my presentation the difficulties one is facing with such an approach, and I might just summarize them to conclude my presentation. There are, for instance, when going back to the first part of my presentation, several sort of variants in the text of the fragments which should be taken into consideration. The one coming from the history of transmission of the source text, the one introduced by the different modern editors about the length of the fragments, and finally the one explained by the different rendering introduced by the ancient author who use the work for their own purposes. Also, with regard to the content, several difficulties arise, as I tried to show in the second part. For instance, not every toponym mentioned in the fragment can be located on a map. Likewise, when trying to match the remaining fragments with the homeric lines, some will not fit, and we will have to introduce degrees of certainty to show the choices modern editor made. But still, I think, and I hope to have shown here, that the digital approach will be more appropriate to present all these issues than a more conventional one. Thank you.